You can look at it there. This conference is going to be a little bit disjointed in the sense of I'm just going to give some basic moral principles. Some of them are connected to each other. They're not exactly connected to each other. Some of them are other ones. But we need to have them so that when it comes time to sort that whether things are right and wrong, we can apply the principles. And that's what I always tell. Recently somebody emailed me and asked me something because she was a doctor and she wanted to get into the area of bioethics. And I said, well, you need to go to some place where you can sit down and study the principles that govern this discussion. And the whole idea of a principle just, wow, yeah, I hadn't thought of that, But, and that's always, it's really, it's disheartening because when you hear people say things like, you'll watch some TV program and like, who's that famous psychologist that's on there? Dr. Phil or whatever his name is, yeah. He'll say, well, I think, and I'm just like, I really don't care what you think. I want to know what the truth is. And the problem is that we're getting people who have no principles. They don't understand the principles that govern the moral life, and yet they still want to be the ones to tell you what to do that's right and wrong. And I always tell people, you wouldn't go to a doctor who had, or you wouldn't go to somebody who's never had any training in surgery whatsoever and tell them, please do brain surgery on me. But for some reason or another, we're willing to talk to somebody who has absolutely no background in the moral life, and they will ask them, what do you think I should do? Well, I think, and the ends are much more drastic. If you have brain surgery from somebody who blotches it, okay, you might die from it, or you might be a little vegetable, but that's only temporary. I mean, the fact of the matter is, though, is that you get the wrong moral advice, and it could be permanent, because you could end up in a place you don't want to end up in as far as your final end goes. So, anyway, as I mentioned, God's designed human nature so that we'll perform specific actions as means to attain the end. Now, the means, these actions that we perform, the church says, in Veritatis Splendor, but it's also part of the moral tradition, that when we're talking about a concrete moral act, there's always three things that go into it. The first, is the object. Now, the object of the moral act is answered by the question, what you are doing. It's the essence of what you're doing, in theft, the essence of what you're doing is you're taking something that belongs to another person. The fact that the purse is pink is circumstantial, is neither here nor there. It doesn't have anything to do with the essence of what you're doing. Now, and sometimes you get people in the confessional and they circumstance you to death. And they tell, well, look, just tell me what, So then you have to listen to them for about 15, 20 minutes. And then you find out, oh, okay, so what you're telling me is you lied. It's that kind of a thing. So the point is that you just tell them, what you're doing, the nature of the object of what you're doing, the moral, what are you doing? Then the second one is the intention or the end. And this answers the question, why are you doing it? Which is different from what you're doing. Well, I was doing this because I was hoping that I was going to attain this. Okay, so these are two different things, of course. And the object, St. Thomas says, the end is either good or bad. You can either have a good intention or a bad intention. But the object, that is what you're doing, is either good, such as giving alms to the poor, or praying to God, not to, some statue or something. Here we're not talking about the legitimate cult of the saints in the Catholic Church, which make use of statuary, but we're talking about, some pagan who prays thinking that if he rubs the statues, he's going to get something out of them. All right. And then bad, something can be bad, such as idolatry or fornication or something like this. So the very nature of it is bad. And then there is some that are indifferent. They're neither morally good or morally bad when considered in themselves. In the concrete, things are always good or bad. But when you abstract out of it and consider, okay, what was the guy doing? Sometimes it's indifferent. So St. Thomas gives an example of lifting a grain of wheat from the earth is neither morally good nor morally bad. A lot of the moralists give the example of going for a walk. It's neither morally good or morally bad. You have to find out, well, what's his intentions behind? Why is he going? Well, he's doing it for the sake of health. Or if the circumstances are bad, well, then that's another matter. And then, of course, there are the circumstances. And these are the things that stand around the act, and they don't change the nature of what you're doing or the essence of what you're doing, but they do affect it in some way. So an example is, you can commit an act of theft, but the quantity can actually change, can make it worse, or is not as bad. So stealing $5 is not as bad than stealing, say, $100. Or stealing money from an elderly woman who has no money and she's just living a subsistence life is not as bad, or is really bad, not as bad. It's worse than, say, stealing $5 from someone like Bill Gates. So, but there's both theft, you're still stealing, and you still have to make restitution, but one is worse than the other, based upon it. And so circumstances either aggravate the badness of the act. So like if you're committing fornication in public, that's a lot worse than just committing fornication outside, but the fact is that it aggravates, it makes it worse. And it can also make it better, a good act better. So praying to God is a good act. Doing it in front of the tabernacle is better because of the fact that you're more proximate to Him and you're in a holy place and it can direct your faculties more, etc. It can also diminish the evil of an act, such as when somebody steals something, but they do it in such a way so that the other person, like I had this one friend of mine he says, I would rather be pickpocketed as opposed to robbed. I'm like, okay, because robbery in the moral tradition always implies force. Someone comes and physically manhandles you and takes your money. As opposed to pickpocketing, you don't even know it. So the pickpocketing isn't as bad. It's still both theft. It's just the way that you did it is different. So it diminishes it. It's not as bad. And then there's some circumstances that are completely indifferent. They don't affect the moral of the act here nor there. Like I said, stealing a pink purse as opposed to a blue purse is neither here nor there, unless there's some strange thing that in this particular market, pink purses are worth a lot of money. All right. So, but of the circumstances, there are 7, of which one of them is broken down into a different one. The first one is who. And this is a quality of the agent performing the action. So for instance, a priest, if he lies or uses profanity or vulgarity or something like this, it's worse than, say, if just a layman does it. When, and an example that a lot of the moralists give is, you can go for a walk, which is morally indifferent, for the sake of intent, for the intention of health, which is good, but then you do it after a curfew, then it's bad. Or another example I give is, St. Thomas says sometimes you can be performing the same act physically, but there can be all different types of different acts attached to this thing. So like, you decide to go out for a walk for the sake of your health and it's a normal time of the day. That's a good thing. But then you see some guy that you don't really like and he's laying cement. And so you walk across this freshly laid cement, you step on his fingers. And then after that, so you can, in the one act of walking, there's all these different moral things that are attached to it. But, so when is a different one. How. In Latin, the word is quo modo, in what way, how you do it. So you're torturing somebody. I tell seminarians, look, I use graphic images because for some reason or other, if you just use things that are everyday, people just don't seem to get it. So you have to use kind of these graphic images. So you're going to torture somebody, right? You could torture him by sticking bamboo under his fingernails, that's how, or you could Chinese water torture him to death, that type of thing. There's different kinds of torture, and so some are worse than others. Still torture, it's just that some are worse than others based upon how you do it. Okay. The next is by what aid? This is going to have a huge impact in the whole discussion of vaccines. But the point is that sometimes we use, you can kill somebody either by using a gun or by strangling them with a rope. So the rope or the gun is the means. Sometimes they sell this as a means, it's to aid the thing that you use to help you to accomplish the task. Then there is where. So where you do it, as I mentioned, married couple wants to have a child, so they engage in the conjugal act, it's an illicit conjugal act, but they do it in public. Okay, the fact that they do it in the wrong place, it makes what would normally be good, bad. All right. Then there's why you did it. And St. Thomas says that this why is the same thing as the end. Why'd you do it? What was your intention? He says it's a circumstance to this, what you're doing. So the end and the circumstances, this end is actually here, but St. Thomas says you have to treat the end separately because why people do it is very, very important. It's one of the most principal circumstances because it tends, what your intentions are very often determines your subsequent deliberation about what you're going to do. And then the last one is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah. The last one is what? Now this is different from this insofar as what, he says, is the effect of the action. So he says washing somebody. So that's the object of the moral act. You're washing somebody. But it might have the effect of warming them or cooling them down. And so that's just a side effect of what you're trying to do. But then also sometimes the what is sometimes a quality of the object of the exterior act. Now that needs a bit of explaining. This pen is the object of the exterior act of writing. It's the thing which I use in order to do this. So it can also be the means by what aid, but it's the thing that, the object of the exterior act is the thing that bears the motion of your action. So I give people an example, throwing a midget off the top of a building. Okay. That's the midget is the object of the moral act. Now, to know whether it's moral, is he a combatant? Am I at war? In which case, it's licit. Am I an executioner for a public state, and he's committed a capital crime? Or is he an innocent man? Okay, so is he an innocent man? Now, for instance, the fact that he's a midget is a quality of his. Or the fact that he's wealthy would be a quality of this thing which I'm throwing. So these are the circumstances of the moral act. And they're quite important. The church says when you go to confession, you have to confess all of the circumstances which would affect the morality of the act. And by that they mean aggravate, make it not as bad, or diminish it, whatever the case is. Okay. Now, keep this in mind, because when we get to certain moral discussions of certain moral acts, you need to know what those what they call the three fonts, the object, the end, and the circumstances are. There are ways of being an accomplice to another person's sin morally. The first is by counsel, when you make suggestions about how to do something. Yeah, go off and have that abortion, that type of thing. The second is by command, do this. And this is the one that doctors have to be really careful with, because you have to make sure that all the commands that you give to people can be executed without sin. So always keep that in mind, because what happens is that the command is sinful, but also the effect of the command, that is, the fact that they do these things and these things happen, you're culpable for. So you have to be careful about that. Now here we're providing the proper effects of your sin. If they do something on their own decision, that's another matter. Consent. Mom and Dad, can I do this? Yeah, sure, go right ahead. Fourth, by provocation. Kids are great. They know just what button to push. Okay, I want Mom to go ballistic because I like it when her hair goes straight up on end. I'll press button, hair on end. So they press that button and then Mom gets this reaction, right? So they know exactly how to provoke their parents. By praise or by flattery. Oh, that was great. You did a good job, encouraging people in their sin. By concealment, and this is hiding the evil that's been done, because now you participate in it by hiding it so people don't know about it. 7, by partaking. Hey, you want to go steal a bunch of money? Yeah, sure, I'll join in with you. 8, by silence. Now the first one is by concealing it. You keep it away, you do something actively to hide the thing, whereas by silence is you don't reveal something when you should. Now there's times you don't have to, but there's sometimes that you have an obligation to speak up. And the ninth, by the defense of the ill done. So you defend the ill that's done. Okay. So those are the ways in which you can be an accomplice to another person's sin. And when you're, like as I mentioned, by command, if a doctor is engaging in surgery and then he has the nurse do something which he knows is going to kill the other person, well then he tells her to do this, then he's culpable for her actions. So is she, but he is too. Conscience. The conscience is the judgment of the intellect of the rightness or wrongness of the thing. In other words, it's the act of the intellect that tells me, look, this thing's wrong or right. And St. Thomas says that conscience is the application of the universal precept. Remember those secondary precepts? Thou shalt not commit adultery. In the concrete circumstances, that is, in the concrete act. So I come up against a certain set of circumstances. I recognize concretely this is an act of adultery. Therefore, I apply the universal precept, do not commit adultery, or thou shalt not commit adultery. And then, seeing that it applies to that, I realize I can't do this concrete act here and now. The conscience, therefore, requires two things. The first is knowledge of the universal precepts. Don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't do this. And St. Thomas says that people have an obligation to come to knowledge of the precepts that fall under the natural law. So, for example, he would say that people who run off and fornicate without knowing that fornication is immoral, he says, that's not good enough. They should have known better. They should have taken reasonable means to come to knowledge of this. Now, there can be subjective and sociological factors that can make it impossible. So, invincible ignorance we can't overcome, but if we have an ability to overcome it, we have to form our conscience according to the natural law. So, I have to know the universal precepts. The second thing is, he says, you have to have the ability to apply it in the concrete. And this is done in a kind of a difficult way. He says, passion clouds our judgment, right? So we have some image of our imagination, we imagine something, that somebody's doing something, and then our emotions arise up to it, and it fogs our image of the imagination. We think it's worse than it is, or not as bad as it is, whatever the case is. And so when we go to judge the thing, we have a hard time applying it in the concrete. And St. Thomas says that to do this, you have to have clear images. You have to be able to think things through clearly, concretely. And unfortunately, he says, passion really messes that up. So those are the two things you need to do good acts of conscience. Sin is a transgression against the law of God, either the natural law or the divine positive law. Now, under the natural law, some would say the civil law also applies. So there's two different theories about whether the civil law applies. Some say that the civil law doesn't bind in the form of conscience. The only thing is you have to be willing to pay the price of the penalty, and that's a matter of honesty if you get caught. That's the Franciscan view. The Thomistic view is no, insofar as it's an ordinance and it's according to the order of reason, it therefore binds in the order of conscience. The magisterium in the last 100 years seems to be falling upon the latter conclusion, that all authority is ultimately derived from God, and that means even civil authority. So if the civil authority is reasonable, then you have an obligation to follow it in the form of conscience. So a mortal sin is one which deviates from your final end, St. Thomas says. Now remember, I said that the natural law is ordinance of directing us in actions towards God, ultimately. He's the ultimate end, even though we might have some proximate end, something that we're trying to achieve here and now. But ultimately, those things have to come under somehow pursuing God in some way. So mortal sin, St. Thomas says, is one which deviates me from my final end. The nature of the means in achieving this end deviates me from my final end, which is God. That's a mortal sin. Well, he just said a venial sin doesn't take you away from your final end, because if you die in the state of venial sin, you still go to heaven. But if you die in the state of mortal sin, you don't. So he says it just detracts against the means. You're messing up on the means, he says. Then there are the effects of sin. And this is one of the ways that we can actually know, since sin is contrary to the natural law, it messes us up. Every time we commit a sin, it disorders our faculties because we act contrary to the ordinance that God has placed in us. And so as a result, we can just get more and more disorder, and so it's harder and harder to function properly. Those effects of sin are, of course, darkness of the intellect. So if you notice that a particular kind of activity is making people stupid, it's probably a sign that, that's probably sinful. There's something wrong with this. And, the more sinful our society gets, the dumber they're getting. I mean, it is. People, remember when I was telling you that you have to be able to apply the universal precepts in the concrete? One of the things I'm really noticing is that you can tell people the universal principle, yeah, but when it comes time to apply it in the concrete because they're leaving sinful lives, they just can't get the thing applied in the concrete. So, one time I was given this homily, I would tell people, no unnecessary servile work on Sunday and no unnecessary commerce. Okay. Then after Mass, Father, we're going to the mall. You want to go with us? And you're just like, they don't seem to get it. And this is what you think. The other thing is, too, is that as part of the darkness of the intellect, as we begin acting contrary to the intellect, it becomes more and more disordered, so it can't function rationally, and we call that mental illness. And I'm noticing that our society is getting more and more mentally ill. And one of the ways you can tell is you walk up to somebody and you'll say, yeah, I'll take Y on the menu. Okay, you wanted X. No, I said Y. Okay, you want Z. They can't even make the connection between what they hear and their actions anymore. So it's kind of scary, actually. Weakness of the will. It's just harder to do the good. And then there's a strong inclination to evil, both in the will, plus then there's also these appetites, these emotions that want to go every which direction. G.K. Chesterton said, the appetites are analogous to running and jumping on a horse and running in all directions. But the way we get those under control is through virtue. Virtue strengthens the will, it gives clarity to the intellect, and it actually decreases the inclination to evil, so that in point in fact, the more virtuous you become, the better you become, the more ordered you become, and the easier things are, and you're not as stupid. These effects are in our faculties, and these effects are sometimes called vices. Every sin has its own specific kinds of effects that it causes. So you can kind of see this. People will, when it comes to a variety of different things, they can see things very clearly, but the minute you get to the area of their sin, they just get blind and they can't see things, and they don't understand what you're talking about, and that type of thing. But some of them have their own proper effects. So like, there's moral effects to sin. So like, someone who commits fornication, well, one of the moral effects is what? They commit a mortal sin, which means they lose their sanctifying grace, they become disordered, their faculties become disordered, their appetites become attached to the conjugal relations that they're engaging in and things like that. Whereas the virtuous one, whereas virtue does the opposite. But so there's moral effects of sin, but then there's what we call proper effects of sin that are non-moral. So, for instance, having children out of wedlock is the product of committing fornication. People today, and this is a sign that people just don't seem to be getting it. When people actually don't believe that the generative faculty is actually ordered towards having children, you've got a huge problem on your hand. They're just blind; they don't see it. So people will commit fornication, like, I don't know how I became pregnant. How did this happen? You're just like, okay. Also, these disorders make it harder to do the right thing in the future. We are culpable for the effects of our sin when our sin is culpable. So if there's a distinction between objective sin and subjective sin. Objective is, in reality, what are you doing? And God takes offense even at objective sin. But then there's subjective sin, that is, what did the guy think he was doing? And that's where the culpability enters into it. And so there's actually effects of the objective sin. So, for example, in fornicating, having children out of wedlock is a proper effect of it, whether you intended it or not. Then there is subjective sin, and those are the effects of the subjective sin, and that is things like losing your state of grace and things like that. We're culpable for all of the effects of our sin, of subjective sin. Of those things which are objective, we're not culpable for the actual effects, providing our ignorance of this is invincible. We can't overcome it. There's no way we could have known any better. If we could have known any better, St. Thomas says, well, then you're culpable for it, because you should have known better. But then there are effects there's disorders in us for which we're not culpable. So none of us are culpable for the defects of original sin, but we all got stuck with them. And there are certain sins, like if our parents commit certain sins, it might cause disorders in us when we're younger, or whatever the case is, and so we kind of carry those as we get older. But, however, you might not be the cause of it, but you're still responsible for getting rid of it. So, for example, I use this example with the seminarians. Some guy, now I don't want to use women because women are much more sensitive and much more capable of understanding the reality of the necessity of having to change a diaper. But a guy, he might take care of a kid all day long. He hasn't changed the diaper all day long. And the wife comes home, his diaper's, awful. Why didn't you change it? He says, well, I didn't mess the diaper up. Well, okay, you might not have been the cause of it. That doesn't mean you're not responsible for it. So you still have to clean it up. The defects that we find in us, we may not be culpable for them, but we have to clean them up. Why? Because if we don't, we become complicit. That is, we consent to their remaining there, and that's where the sin resides. So even if we're not, then you have to you become complicit if you don't start doing something. Second, you have to take reasonable means to overcome them. So if you don't take reasonable means and you are complicit in them, then in point in fact you're culpable for these defects. And this is what I tell homosexuals. Okay, you might not have been the cause of the thing. That's not the point. The point is, it's your task to clean up the mess. And that's what a lot of times they want to say, well, I didn't cause it, so that's okay. Well, wait a minute. Now they're becoming complicit in the fact that the thing is there. We have to be careful about that. A law, so sin is a transgression of the law of God. Natural law, you transgress the natural law, it's sinful. All right. And the natural law, of course, we formulated in secondary precepts for us to understand it intellectually, but these precepts are really what? They're formulations of what our natural inclinations are, or what we shouldn't do based upon our natural inclinations. A law is a promulgated ordinance of reason, so it's something that's promulgated, the guy publishes it. Ordinance of reason, so it's a direction, it's a rational direction towards something, of he who has care of the community. Now God, when we're talking about the natural law, God promulgates the natural law when he creates the human nature. In other words, once the human nature is created, it becomes it's knowable by looking at it. So, and it's an ordinance of reason. He designs our faculties and our nature to perform actions in a reasonable way, that is, to achieve good ends, and ends which are according to an order, so they all fit together rather than fighting against each other. And it's he who has care of the community. Obviously, God's in care of the whole community. And then, of course, I said there's three kinds of law: the natural law, the divine positive law, that's in Revelation, such as when Christ says to the apostles, go and evangelize all nations. They don't have a right to come back and say, no, you can't evangelize the nation. Sorry, it's part of divine positive law. Sometimes the precepts of charity, love your neighbor and love God, and then love your neighbor for the sake of God, are usually considered divine positive law, although it can be argued that they're required by the natural law but only fulfillable by grace. As I mentioned, all laws are part of the eternal law. They're expression of the eternal law. Now, there's a few other principles I want to just talk about. The first...
What's the third law?
Oh, civil law.
Natural law.
Natural law, divine positive law, and civil law. There is this thing called, and this is the one that's really taken it in the chops these days, the principle of the integral good. This principle states that good is from an integral cause, evil from any defect whatsoever. What's that mean? It means that the whole thing has to have its proper causes and be there in order for it to be good. If there's anything missing or there's some defect, then the thing's bad. So I always give people an example. You have this woman that's just stunning. She's a knockout, but her nose is missing. Okay, well, she's not exactly beautiful because her nose is missing. Even though the rest of her body might have all the proportions and things like that, the fact her nose is missing isn't. Or a guy's missing his arms or things like that. Well, in moral action, remember those three fonts? all of them have to be good in order for the moral act to be morally good. They have to be morally good or indifferent at least. So if the object is good or indifferent, the circumstances are good, and the end is good, it's a good moral act. If just one of those is missing, it's morally bad. Now I'll give you an example of an area where this has really missed the boat. You'll go to people and they say, how was the movie? It was a good movie. But then you say, okay, so you watch the movie. Constant blaspheming of our Lord's name. There's portraying of the conjugal act on the film. There's immodesty running all over the place. And then you say, well, how is this was a good film? And what people mistake is that artistic goodness is not the same thing as moral goodness. And if there's a single moral defect in the movie, it's morally bad. And this is why I tell people, if you click that button knowing that there's this morally bad thing on the film, you become an accomplice to that action, and you become you become culpable for it, because this thing gets into reality and it offends God. All right. So the principle of the pseudo-Dionysian, sometimes it's called the pseudo-Dionysian principle of the integral good. All of the parts have to be good for it to be morally good. One thing, and this is the foundation for the principle that the ends do not justify the means. The end might be good, but the evil is there's a defect in the means, and that means that the action's bad. So the moral act, which is based upon those three things, is bad morally. You can have a good moral object, you know. I'm praying. I use the example I used before. Couple wants to have a children, good intention. They engage in the conjugal acts. They're illicitly married, so that's fine, but they do it in public. One of the font's bad, the whole thing is bad in the end. Now we can make psychological distinctions where we can say, well, this part's good and that part's good, but when you're looking at the whole, it's bad because there's a part that's missing. The natural law is prior to any human positive law. Now the human laws, the civil laws, or human laws, have a threefold relationship, St. Thomas says, to the natural law. They are either according to the natural law, such as laws against murder or laws against theft, things like that. In the moral tradition, the state has every right to enact fornication and sodomy laws because it's against the natural law. I'm working with a group of Christian lawyers and philosophers, and they asked me to be on the thing. They're actually drafting a constitution for a Christian government, and one of the parts of the Constitution is that you can be prosecuted for a crime of which there is no statute, and that is, the crime is that which is against the natural law. So you can be prosecuted for sin if there's no statute. Now, it's not the type of thing you're going to be going around prosecuting every single sin. It just means if it becomes egregious, they don't have to point to some statute to say, look, you can't do that. Then there is that which is aside the law. Now, this is one in which is quite important. Like, for instance, the fact that you can only park in a specific parking place from Wednesdays from 4 to 6 in the afternoon is a purely civil law. The natural law doesn't tell me I can't park in a particular location from 4 to 6. But it's aside from the natural law because it's something above and beyond the natural law, but it should be according to the order of reason. And it's not contrary to the natural law, which is the third one. And St. Thomas says that if it's contrary to the natural law, it's not really a law. Because why? A law is an ordinance of reason. A promulgated ordinance of reason, well, it's not reasonable. It's not according to the order of reason, that is according to natural law, and therefore it's not a law. Another principle, so the natural law takes precedence over the civil law. In other words, you can never promulgate a civil law and it attain force of law if it's contrary to the natural law. The principle, another one is called the principle of order. This is one in which right order must be kept and not disturbed. We just recognize, like, right order, by order we like order in society, order within the family, order within the hospital. You don't upset the order that's there if it's going to cause damage or problems. Right order requires that the means being ordered they're being ordered and are proportionate to the end. Now, what's this mean? An action, let's say, for example, my end is to preserve my life. And some guy's trying to attack me. Now, I have to take means in order to preserve my life. Now, I know this guy is a wimp. So if I just take the butter knife and stab him in the thumb, he'll whimper and run off. So then that's all I should do. I shouldn't do much more than that. I don't take a bazooka out and pull the trigger and blow him away, you know, when he's trying to, because why? The end is not proportionate to the means is not proportionate to the end. And so this ordering means that the means has to be directed to the end, so you don't direct it to some other thing. And it also has to be proportionate. It doesn't go beyond and it doesn't fall short of achieving this end. Then there is what we call the principle of totality. And this states that the part is for the sake of the whole. Or the part may be sacrificed for the sake of the whole. And this is one which doctors, of course, use all the time. You know, you do surgery because why? Well, you got to get the appendix out because if you don't, he's going to die from it. So you sacrifice the appendix for the sake of the whole. Then there is what was called the principle of the lesser of two evils. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you're in charge of a bridge that opens and closes, and there's a train coming on. It's got 160 passengers on it, and the bridge is open. And that day you happen to be taking care of your kid, and you look down, and he's in the gears of the machinery that closes this thing. Now, you don't have time to get get the kid out, and close the thing so that the train can pass by safely. One or the other has to go. Now, most people today would just say, well, you should save your kid. You know, well, it's a matter of proportion here. I mean, you have to choose the lesser of two evils. The answer in that case is you got to close the gate, because you can't save one life at the expense of 160. That's irrational. In the case of the lesser of two evils, and this is important because in legislation about abortion, a legislator who is known for his pro-life stance, of course, that's what the condition is in the Evangelium Vitae, can vote for a law that lessens the number of abortions. People say, well, you're choosing evil. No, you're not actually. The object of moral act, what you're doing, is in fact reducing the number of abortions by means of this law, and the intention is to reduce the number of abortions. That's in fact what you're doing. You're not, because the fact that there's going to be these other abortions that occur are aside from your intention. You don't intend those. Your intention is to reduce the number of abortions. In fact, you have an obligation to reduce that number. And so, in point of fact, in the case of the lesser of two evils, when you choose the lesser evil, you're not really choosing the evil as such. You're choosing what? To do the good so that less evil comes as a result of it. Then there's what we call the principle of double effect. Again, all these are kind of important because we'll bring them all together when we start going through the bioethics section. The principle of double effect. According to St. Thomas, there's three principles or three things that govern the principle of double effect. And a double effect is a case in which you have an action of which there's more than one effect that occurs, at least two effects that occur. And he says, in order to employ the principle of double effect, you have to have three things in place. One, the act itself must be good. In other words, you have to be doing something when the object is good in its very nature. You know, it's not a case of well, it's not too bad. No, it has to be good. What you're doing has to be good. So, like in the case of preserving my life, that's my end, to preserve my life, preservation of my life. I use a means, which is actually what? Engaging in a set of means to preserve my life. So I'm preserving my life is the end, conservation of my life is the end. So I'm doing a good thing, I'm trying to preserve my life. Second, the act has to have at least two effects, one good and one bad. If they're both good, it's not an issue. But there has to be one that's good and one that's bad. If they're both bad, well, then you can't do it. But if there's one good and one bad, of which only the good effect is intended and the bad effect is aside your intention. He says, in this case, now here we're talking about the principal double effect is only in a case in which you have no choice. You've got to do something, because there's two effects that are going to come from this. So, and if you don't do it, some other bad effect is going to occur. Like, so for instance, with ectopic pregnancies, you know, the death of the child is aside from your intention. What you're doing is you're preserving the life of the mother. And the good effect is her life. The bad effect is the child's going to die from it, but you have to do it indirectly. We'll talk about that later. But you can't sit there and, if the life of the mother really isn't in jeopardy, say, well, we're going to take the kid out as principal double effect. No, because there's not, if in the case of where you didn't deal with the ectopic pregnancy, the woman's going to hemorrhage to death eventually and die. 3, there must be a proportion between the good effect and the bad effect. For St. Thomas, strictly speaking, there has to be a proportion between the means taken and the bad effect. What's this mean? To preserve my life, which is the effect, and it's also the end, my life, the means has to be proportionate. You can't go beyond and or less than that. We mentioned that a little earlier. But some moderns say, well, it's not just that, but between the two effects, there has to be a proportion. So the saving of the life of the mother is proportionate to the loss of the child in the case of the ectopic pregnancy. So there's a certain proportion. But you couldn't use the principle of double effect of, I'm getting old and my face is sagging, and so I'm going to have surgery. So the good effect is my face will look like it's been pulled tight. The bad effect is going to be I'm going to be in a lot of pain. So there's a certain proportion. Now look at, you can't be hacking into something that's not ill. We'll talk about that principle a little bit later. Moderns introduce a fourth principle that says that the evil effect cannot be the cause of the good effect. Okay. These are just some of these are the basic principles which are necessary to begin discussing then the actual content of bioethics. And I think we'll stop there, so that because it's going to be a bit of a marathon when we get to the actual bioethics part, because there's a lot of stuff contained in that. Okay, so we'll end there, and I'll see you after lunch.